Hey everyone, it's Mark. I want to share something today. It's something that I've been thinking about, and it was brought up in many of the past events, tragedies that I've seen where police officers have used inappropriate force by all methods of police training, inappropriate force, improper force, whatever it is, violated rules or safety priorities, firearm rules, whatever it is. And where it really came to me is an event that happened last year, but was just now gaining a lot of notoriety this year due to a lawsuit against a police department in northern Colorado that I'm familiar with through my career. It's not my agency, but a neighboring agency. And some of the issues around an event that happened where a police officer arrested a 73-year-old lady with dementia for allegedly stealing $14 worth of products from a Walmart. And this officer used physical force to try to take this lady into custody, ended up dislocating her shoulder. And then subsequent to that, the video, the body camera video became a source of entertainment and amusement to that officer and a couple of other officers post-event. So what has happened so far is that because of the lawsuit now, there are 5 officers involved in the incident and 2 supervisors and 3 officers. The officers have all been terminated or resigned, and the supervisors have been dealt with administratively within the agency. Now, it started me thinking, because when these things happen, because I say that there's a problem in policing, and of course, it's not every police officer. If you extrapolate that, then please listen. It's not every police officer, it's not every agency, but there seems to be every day I look at least a half a dozen different stories of police officers doing things that can be construed as misconduct, and more are being charged with crimes nowadays and being fired from their position as police officers. So obviously there's some credence and credibility to these misuses of force. So anyway, what I often hear is the bad apples, right? Oh, it's bad apples. There's a few bad apples. And so my thing is this, with this case at this Northern Colorado agency, is this. If these 3 officers, so now we're going to have to say these 3 officers are the bad apples, right? They're bad or whatever, or at least the one officer is a bad apple. This isn't a big agency, so there's not a lot of room for all the good apples to not notice the bad apples. My thing is this. The public should be asking this. If they're these bad apples, one, how did they get hired? If there's not an issue in the agency, right? If law enforcement is fine, as I hear many people saying, is if they're the best trained now, the best prepared, we're hiring great officers and everybody's doing 99.9% of the officers are doing a great job. How are these bad apples getting through? Aren't all the other good apples going, hey, that's a bad apple. They shouldn't be here. How are they getting, one, recruited, hired, trained, and then allowed to work? If they're bad apples and the system is fine, those bad apples should be obvious. They shouldn't even make it through. Secondly, who's training them? And in the process of the training, aren't these trainers who are supposed to be fantastic, aren't they seeing these officers and going, oh, no, they shouldn't be here? So why aren't we noticing that? Well, that speaks to that there's a problem systemically. It speaks to there's an issue systemically that is not identifying these bad apples. There are enough so-called bad apples that they don't recognize another bad apple. They see it as an okay apple, right? If I've got to use this analogy, I hate it because it doesn't make sense. But for some people, it's all that makes sense. So what I'm saying is that we need to be looking at the supervisors. The supervisors who supervise these people day in and day out, who didn't recognize that these people were deficient in their skills and abilities. Because that speaks to one of 2 things. Either the supervisor isn't paying attention, or the supervisor thinks that what they're doing is okay. It's one or the other. Right? If they're a supervisor, they should be paying attention to what their people do, and the people should be doing the job appropriately. Okay? So that's what we have to be doing. I think We have to be looking at the accountability when these situations happen, which if you look at them, they're happening to officers who are between 10 and fewer years, mostly 5 and fewer years, 5 and newer on the job. It's happening all over the country. Or some of the high profile ones, the Greorge Floyd murder, the Daunte Wright shooting in Minneapolis. Those two officers were veteran officers and field training officers who were training officers at that moment. They had officers in training at that moment. So as we're sitting there looking at these events happening all over the country, we need to understand why they're happening. And I believe it's because these new officers are being trained by these bad veteran officers to be poor performing officers. I don't think they're bad apples. I think they're well-intended people who are operating on bad intel. And that's where we need to look. Don't look at the two-year cop to say, hey, they're not doing. Who trained them? Who prepared them? Who supervises them? Those are the people we need to look at. And until we start to look at the veteran officers, the trainers, the supervisors, and not just the police chief who showed up 3 years ago and now we fire him as a sacrificial lamb because, oh well, the culture in that agency is already set. That police chief is not changing much coming from the outside. Trust me, I've seen it. I had a chief who came from the outside. He was there 14 years, never accepted totally by the command staff. So it's not all on that one person. It's the culture of the agency. So we need to be looking at the people who are supervising and the people who are training when we're going to try to hold accountable these new officers who get into these questionable uses of force. I want to solve the problem, people. I don't want it to continue. I don't want to keep going on and making excuses like split-second decision in a rapidly changing environment or the public's got to raise their kids better. No, I don't want. Those are excuses that don't do anything. I'm looking to how we can improve the product and improve the service. What can we do better? If you stayed this long, thank you. We need to look at it, and we need to look at who's preparing these officers who are getting into these questionable shootings. Who's supervising these officers who are dislocating the shoulders of 73-year-old dementia patients? That's where the problem lies.